Welcome to the Conservative Caucus podcast. I'm president of the Conservative Caucus. Just had a great interview with my friend Cliff Maloney. Cliff played a key role in the Trump win in just this last November 5th. And he's from Citizens Alliance, and he headed up the Pennsylvania Chase efforts. We talked about what he did to help secure votes in Pennsylvania, how he went about it, what some of the methodologies were, the philosophy behind it. You know, Grassroots is fundamental to our ability to maintain liberty in the American Republic. And Cliff played a key role in this last election. Of course, we talked about the challenges of getting that done then, but also the challenges we have moving forward and what we want to do. A little background on Cliff. He's from Philadelphia. He's the CEO of Citizens Alliance, the founder of Pennsylvania Chase. We've known each other since he was running Young Americans for Liberty. They targeted 500,000 doors in Pennsylvania and did even more than that, and really chased people's ballots to help them make sure that they got their votes in. This is key to elections, and it's a fantastic discussion that I want you to listen very closely to, because these are the things we target through the Conservative Caucus. And by the way, if you'd like to learn more about how to be a grassroots leader in your area and how we can help you at the Conservative Caucus, go to the conservativecaucus.org. You'll find out more information. You're going to get lobbying tips, how you can lobby your state and local legislatures, Democrat rebuttals. We rebut what false ideas of Democrats, and you want to get a lot of help there. Of course, you can get a hold of our Citizen Action Kit. And our Citizen Activism University is there as well. You want to check that out also. So go to theconservativecaucus.org. And, of course, follow us on X at TC Caucus and me at Jim Pfaff on X as well. So with that, here's my conversation with Cliff Maloney, and check it out. Hey, so my friend Cliff Maloney from Citizens Alliance. A lot of people have seen Cliff on television, actually, a lot, talking about all the work they did in Pennsylvania in this election cycle. And Cliff and I have been friends a lot of years, and I'm really glad to have him on some of our early podcasts in our effort here with the Conservative Caucus. And man, Cliff, we just had a huge election. And even though I thought it was going to be huge, I predicted 311 to 315 electoral votes. I mean, I got the prediction right, but it just feels a whole lot better than I thought it was going to end up feeling. I mean, do you agree with me?
Yeah, I think, we all should be high off the win right now. We should enjoy it. But remember, we were still close to having a President Kamala Harris, so that should scare the bejesus out of a lot of us. But yeah, we should enjoy the win. It does feel good. I don't know if it's quite sank in yet. I think once DOGE becomes a reality in terms of policy, that'll be the moment where it kind of starts to feel real. But that's a battle ahead, and we'll see where we go.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I'm glad you said that, because we'll talk about that, and because that's the rub. I mean, I've been working politics for 30 years. I've had mostly downs, a lot of pretty cool ups, but this was, I don't know, hopefully the beginning of something very, very cool. But it's got to come through, and we'll hit up on the 2026 elections a little bit here, because I know you're going to be doing stuff. We're going to be doing some big things. But if these Republicans don't support Donald Trump bringing it about, man, I think there's going to be a bit of heck to pay for them, because DOGE is really important. And I'm really glad about Elon and Vivek. But I want to get into that. I want to try to give people a little sense of why you and I are talking, how it relates to what just happened in 2024, because it's not like this is your first time around the block doing election stuff. Tell people, I want to get into what Pennsylvania Chase was, what Citizens Alliance is, but I want to make sure that people have a little bit of understanding about your background. To set this question up for you, just let me say this. Cliff Maloney went out and targeted Pennsylvania, knowing that Pennsylvania was a must-win state for Donald Trump. Or at least we thought it at the beginning. It actually ended up being a must-win state for Kamala Harris, but it sealed the deal for sure. But this was a really big issue. Pennsylvania had hardly ever been in play since, frankly, Ronald Reagan. It hadn't been really regularly in play. Always kind of tantalizing, but really never in play for a Republican presidential candidate. But we saw after 2016 and 2020 a real opportunity to really bring it in more consistently. And I know that you went out there and said early on, man, this is what we're going to do. We're going to make this happen. It's your home state. You're an Eagles fan. I don't hold that against you, but I totally respect it, by the way. And in fact, actually kind of ended up being the Vince Papale of the 2024 election this time, FYI. But to set that up, tell people a little bit about your background and what you're all about, and what really kind of laid the foundation for what you did, and then kind of lead us into what got you thinking about how you wanted to take over your home state permanently.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jim. And just always want to start, you've been a great mentor, friend, somebody I can go to for feedback. So for everybody listening out there, they say in politics, if you want a friend, get a dog, but there are a rare few. So I appreciate you. My background's pretty simple. I was studying to be a math teacher in Pennsylvania. I got involved working for Ron Paul, ended up working for Rand Paul when he ran for president. And when Rand Paul had his Senate reelect in 2016, after he dropped out of the race for president, I kind of had this epiphany moment. And that was that in the general election, obviously the year Trump won, in a lot of these states, whether the red states, blue states, purple states, you had Republicans with robust volunteer operations, knocking doors, making calls. And then you had Democrats with both robust volunteer and paid efforts when it came to a ground game, right? Knocking on doors and making phone calls. And I kept thinking to myself, why don't Republicans have this, right? Why aren't Republicans competing in this paid space of building a real infrastructure, a ground game, and putting canvassers full-time out in the field? And so pretty much since then, I have been working, whether it was my time at Young Americans for Liberty for 2018, 19, and then 20 cycles, whether it's Citizens Alliance 21, 22, obviously 23, and then 24. But we've always kind of said our number one focus is to use this paid ground game tactic to try to turn out voters that typical GOP campaigns struggle to turn out. And honestly, if you ask me to put it bluntly, I just want to compete with the Democrats at every tactic or every tool that's in our toolkit. And so what happened was in 2022, Citizens Alliance exists in Pennsylvania, Idaho, North Dakota, and New Hampshire. Okay, those have been our target states, different battles in each state. 2 of them are red states, the other 2 are purple states. And so some we're focusing on primaries, some in the general. But we're always door knocking, right? We've knocked over 8 million doors now through these different programs that we've managed. And we've won over 400 state elective races, which that's where I usually spend all my time. Jim, you know that. My shtick is the battle is at the state legislative level, right? But in 2022, something changed, which was we had some of our state House and state Senate candidates in Pennsylvania that were in R+10 districts almost lose in the general election. And it was because the Democrats had such a great ground game, and there were these new rules in PA that allowed for 50 days of mail-in voting, and we were just sitting out for 49 of them. And we just said to everybody, hey, vote on election day. There's no strategy. There's no plan. But we're just going to turn out and we'll beat them and overwhelm them on election day. And so I just kind of was, putting my head against the wall saying, what are we going to do about this? And about a year ago, I get a call from Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk, founder, president at Turning Point. And he pretty much says to me, listen, he says, I'm going to go to war against some of the establishment consultants. We are owning Arizona and Wisconsin when it comes to chasing the ballot, registration, et cetera. And he said, I want you to own Pennsylvania. He said, you have your Citizens Alliance group there. You guys are the door knocking champs across the country. How do I get you to put all of your energy, all of your time into running this ballot chase effort in Pennsylvania? And I said, look, Charlie, I said, there's a couple things. One, I don't play on Team Red. Okay, I am a Republican, but I'm a conservative. I'm a liberty lover. And so I like to focus on the Republicans that actually stand for the principles of the Constitution. And so I said, number one, if I do this, I want to be able to pick certain areas of the state that we can target. Okay, I want to be able to pick down ballot races so I can reward some of our liberty champions by running up the scores or helping them win in tough swing districts. Number two, I don't want to be siloed, okay? I don't want a GOP that doesn't talk to us, that doesn't share data, that doesn't refine targeting. I don't have any time for that. And number three, we can't have Donald Trump coming out on September 1st or September 15th saying, don't vote by mail. And so, Charlie not only checked all those boxes, he publicly endorsed the PHAs. Trump's team was very instrumental in getting us support, really putting us in front of some funders. And so we launched. And when we launched, Jim, it was pretty simple. We said, hey, the average Republican in Pennsylvania statewide gets about 20% of the mail-in vote. And we said, all right, how do we take that and increase it to 33%? So that was our public goal. The way we were going to do it was hire 120 full-time ballot chasers, knock doors from September 1 through Election Day, and we wanted to hit 500,000 doors. And just so I don't bury the lead, we ended up knocking 510,000 doors, and Donald Trump received 34.5% of the mail-in vote, winning the state by just under 2 percentage points.
It's a huge effort. By the way, this whole early voting thing really gets at the center of what you're doing. I mean, you always have to work grassroots. I've been running campaigns, since 1992 election cycle, 94 election cycle, excuse me. And it's so critical to have a good grassroots effort. People don't understand. There is no correlation between the amount of money you raise and electoral success. No doubt you got to have money and you got to raise enough money to win, and having the money advantage is great for anybody. But all things being equal, if you do not have a good grassroots game, and when I say all things being equal, I mean, you're not a Democrat running in Manhattan or a Republican running in Oklahoma, right? So that's not equal. I'm talking about where it matters in that 5 to 10% range of variability or advantage. You can win you can win a 5+D district as a Republican or vice versa if you've got a great ground game. Unless just the environment is so horrible. But they're all winnable with less money. I remember for me, the big epiphany for me in all of this was in 2006. I was working at Focus on the Family. I had helped run marriage amendments prior to that. And Dr. Dobson came to me and said, you're going to run the Colorado marriage amendment, which was really big because was focused on the family's backyard. You can't lose that one when you're pushing for marriage. So Colorado had just changed their laws then. They weren't a mail ballot state as they are now. And we'll talk about mail ballots and all those definitions here in a little bit. But it had 20 days of early voting. They had expanded the requirements, or lessened the requirements, I should say, for absentee ballots, so they were easier to get. And then obviously still same day voting. So you had in-person 20-day early voting in the county clerk's office, expanded mail ballots, and then election day. So I went out there and I targeted, first of all, we identified about 250,000 people that we knew would make the difference and could go our way, that were low proclivity voters, kind of mid to low proclivity. And we went after them. We got them to get out to early vote in those 20 days. We got them through the absentee ballot thing. the whole design of what Democrats do in politics right now really had its ground zero in Colorado, because in 2004, they had taken back the state. They'd taken over the state, a reliably Republican legislative state, pretty reliably. Now, you had a Democrat governor and Republican governors go back and forth, but the two governors that were Democrats in recent history by that time were both very libertarian-minded people, Roy Romer and these guys. And so it wasn't a challenge for a conservative way of thinking. Well, Democrats were changing everything, and we beat the system that Democrats use these days that year. And Colorado's gone downhill ever since, and I've never had so much control over anything. But the point I'm making is, when you target doing an election based upon what the law says you can do, and you do grassroots politics well, you can win, unless the year's just so bad. And that was a bad year for Republicans that year, and for conservatives in general. The Democrats took over the House, the Congress, both houses, and Colorado was a blue turning state, and we passed a marriage amendment with 60% of the vote. But this is really what we're looking at. Republicans have not there have been good grassroots gains, but they haven't taken advantage of the opportunities of what the law tells them they can do. This is a mindset change that I think finally happened this year. What do you think finally got into Donald Trump's mind to not, kibosh these efforts this time? And what do you think was the mindset change? How did that come about? And why have we finally gotten to the place where we're trying to run elections the way that they are laid out?
Yeah, well, number one, I want to just agree with your point about spending, and being outspent or outraised. I totally agree. I mean, I think the thing that I always tell the grassroots to be careful about is you can't win these races with just grassroots, right? If your opponent is spending, millions of dollars on television, it's tough for you to compete, right? If you have no air to match them, or at least be within 50% or 40% of what they're spending. Same thing goes for mail, texting, digital radio. But to add on that grassroots component, right, at a fraction of the cost compared to these big TV ads, if we can get the consultant class to understand that, you see tons of success. So what changed? Number one, you had Susie Wiles, Chris LaCivita, and James Blair running the campaign, right? And their edict early on was, we have to compete. We have to work on these mail-in, just the culture of mail-in voting within the Republican Party, within the presidential campaigns, et cetera. So they led on the charge. Okay, you pair that with Charlie Kirk running his own winter meeting in Las Vegas a year ago to kind of say to the GOP, hey, it's time to wake up, right? Bringing in and training the state committeemen, the state committee women, the state chairs, the county chairs, right? From the bottom up, getting the GOP elected folks that are actually representing the RNC to realize the value of what we need to do. So don't think this just happened in a vacuum, right? Don't think this just occurred because there was pressure, there was leverage from bright minds, some of the brightest minds when it comes to operatives on our side. They actually said, hey, if we're going to win, we need to push this. It might mean less money for the consulting class on TV ads. It might mean money that has to be dispersed out to 501c4s or super PACs. But that was the great genius of the Trump campaign, was they were willing to play ball because they wanted to win, right? It wasn't all about just profiting and these other things. They wanted to win. So there was a lot of leverage that went into that. And I think, they did a great job at persuading and demonstrating to Donald Trump, this is the path to victory. And, the Democrats laughed. Well, Republicans, they all say mail-in voting is a fraudulent scheme, and they're very skeptical. Well, the Democrats aren't laughing now, because the adjustments were made. We adapted. We had all these different. And by the way, the Democrats have 5 to 10 different organizations that register voters, chase voters, do GOTV outside of the presidential campaigns, right? 501c3s, 501c4s. We don't need, some people are like, man, there's a lot of groups. I'm like, a lot of groups. We're not even at half of what the Democrats have when it comes to these 501c4 organizations and PACs. So I'm a big fan that, we need a lot of people. Many hands makes for light work. We've got to all be singing from the same song sheet. And I think this was the first cycle you saw that synergy on the right.
Well, and hopefully that's a big change, because I've been speaking out against the consultant class in the Republican Party for a long period of time. There's this incestuous relationship in these consulting groups that don't think like you and I think on grassroots politics, and frankly, they still don't. It changed for the Trump campaign, and hopefully it expands and reforms itself, but the inertia is still on the consultant class side, because there's a lot of money at stake. These people make a lot of money and they can win enough to keep going along, but no one's held them accountable for losses. So that whole attitude's got to change. But that's a big part of this. But keeping the reins back on this before we move too far forward, give people a sense of what the 2024 presidential election looked like, maybe as far back as 2021. Because even though we saw some of these changes take place, let's just be candid. It did not look, in my opinion, very good after the 2020 election. I mean, I think we all know that there were freaky things that happened in 2020. I'm not saying the election was stolen necessarily. I've got my ideas and opinions. We're not going to talk about that. But there was a lot of conservatives and Republicans were very dispirited. Donald Trump got whacked upside the head by a media and a censorship regime in Washington that shut so many things down that should have caused him to win that election easily. What were we facing by late 2021, 2022 as we were getting here?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people obviously were upset, and I will give a little opinion. I mean, people ask all the time, it's supposed to be this gotcha question about whether the election was stolen or not. It's like, well, look, how do you define stolen, right? If executives are changing rules and courts are ruling in a way that is really just unprecedented, then you should ask
unconstitutional.
Right. So, I think a lot of us were just kind of soul searching after that. I was focused on the 2022 midterms, and I think a lot of it was understand. Look, here's how I break down the behavior or the mindset of not just the Republican Party, but more so the voters, right? In 2020, we all said, hey, we're going to vote on election day. It's the most secure way to vote, right? In 2021, we said, hey, maybe the courts are going to fix this. They failed us. In 2022, we said, oh, you know what? We're back to the legislature. Let's see if they'll fix it, both at the federal and state level. Completely failed us. In 2023, we got beat so bad, Jim, that we got punched in the mouth. We all stood up. We looked in the mirror and said, okay, time to regroup. We got to rethink this. What are we going to do? And I really think that's, the whole push with Charlie, with the RNC. You have Wiles, LaCivita, and Blair pushing this new strategy. And I think a lot of people, and Trump coming out publicly saying, vote however you can. If you got to vote by mail, if you got to vote early, you got to vote in person, just make sure you vote. And so I think there was this, and by the way, that was my evolution, right? I think that was the evolution of a lot of people, was getting to that point and understanding, okay, we all hate mail-in ballots. We love single-day voting, paper ballots, hand count, no same-day registration, voter ID. Sure, but those aren't the rules, right? And I think a lot of us came to terms with this. Okay, are we just going to concede the election because we don't like the rules, or are we going to adapt and play by them? And I think that was the trick, was getting, not the trick, but getting enough people. Look, in Pennsylvania, I'll give you the specifics, okay? They changed the rules during COVID. They allow for 50 days of mail-in voting, okay? 50, not 15, 50 days. And so, we would go out and target these low propensity voters that they're Trump supporters, but they're not Trump voters. At least they're not consistent Trump voters, right? And so you're talking to them and saying, listen, if you fill out this application, because in Pennsylvania, you have to apply for a ballot. You have to request it, right? You don't need a request. Some states, they send a ballot voter, right? That is not the case in PA. And Democrats in 2020, they used two things. One, they had a great ground game. They understood a Chase program. And so they went out door to door, millions of dollars. But what they did was the second thing, they used the fear of COVID, which obviously Democrats had a much higher fear because that was the propaganda they were getting fed, right? And that's how Biden, people talk about these record numbers in 2020. Look at the amount of people they got to request the ballots. They didn't have a record return rate. The return rate was actually better in 2024 than 2020 by percentage. But they had so many people that requested a mail-in ballot. And that's how they were able to run up the score. And so our whole thing this cycle was just trying to get people into that mindset that if you get a ballot, it's much easier to vote. And so we were not only able to do that, but then really just push these people to understand, once they had a ballot at their door, it was an easy conversation. And Jim, look, me and you have done races for years. Primaries, when you're doing door to door, it's tough. I got to say, listen, Cliff Maloney's a rhino scumbag. Jim Pfaff is a patriot. You're trying to educate them on the difference between Republicans, right? That's a tough sell. General election, you're usually talking to swing voters at the door. So once again, you got to have issues that they agree with. You got to connect them. You're not just selling the party. You're really trying to connect and get them to support your side. This is completely different. This is going to a Trump voter's door, a Trump supporter's door, saying, hey, Bob, you got a ballot sitting on your dining room table. I need you to send that back. If you send it back, we'll never talk to you again, right? The Democrats call this the power of annoying the voter. It's a reminder campaign. And you just keep going back every 7 days. Some people we talked to 6 times. I'm not proud to tell you that, right? Hopefully they eventually got their ballot in.
No, you should be very proud for doing that because that's exactly what you're supposed to do. You have to be repetitive, but go ahead.
Yeah, and so that was the whole process. And the number that really got me to launch the PA chase was when we looked at the data. In 2020, Trump allegedly lost PA by 80,000 votes. Okay, I got to put allegedly in there for some of our friends who like that word.
It was one of 2 states where you had really freaky things happening after Election Day, both Michigan and Pennsylvania, for sure. Go ahead.
So he wins. Biden wins by 80,000 votes. Well, we pulled the numbers. There were 141,000 Republicans that actually went through the process of requesting their ballot that never sent it back. That is a why. Like, hold on a second. These Republicans have a ballot sitting on their table, and nobody ever talked to them, right? Nobody targeted them to say, hey, with that specific message that you have a ballot. Sure, they saw the TV ads. They got the mailers just like everybody else, but nobody went to them with a custom message that they have a ballot sitting on their table. And so this whole cycle was about how do we fix that problem of 141,000 and get that number way down. So we'll have the final numbers here on December 23rd. The state will release Election Day. So we'll know if any of those people, but we're below 90,000 at this point. So I'm proud of that, to know that we've really cut into that to make sure that we exhaust and get as many back as possible.
One thing as you're talking about that, people don't understand that the job of a candidate campaign, really any campaign, is to get all your voters out. It's not to persuade people. That seems really weird to folks, but you have to start as a base of getting your voters out, because we don't have people 100% voting in elections. Down in Brazil, and I've done a lot of work related to Brazil, and I know a lot of the congressmen down there, and it's a huge issue what's happening to these people. But in Brazil, the one thing that exists is by law you have to vote if you're eligible to vote. You must vote. Like you'll get fined, and there are recriminations for that. That's not the case here. So the number one thing is to get your voters out, which means you have to know who your voters are. And then there are persuadable things like this is what you do on the airwaves. And if you find that your people are getting out and you know where those people are and you know what their activity is, then you also make sure that those who are persuadable, of course, you can find a persuadable voter by how they register to vote or their voter history. You can figure that out beforehand and know that they're your voter by other means, polling them, pulling up consumer data. You can do a lot of data stuff that can help you figure out if they're your voter and they're not necessarily Republican if you're a Republican candidate. But you got to get your voters out.
Yeah, and I mean, this is funny, but it goes back to Lincoln. Lincoln had his famous 4-step that, anybody in the political world, it's funny because I'm always telling people it might have been in the 1800s, but a lot of times, political strategists
exactly
and volunteers,
yeah.
Right. They say, squirrel, there's all these distractions. And it's like, listen, just go back to what Lincoln said, because it still reigns true. Number one, figure out who all the voters are that are registered. Okay. Number two, go see who are your supporters. Number three, out of those that are persuadable, try to persuade them and figure out who you have persuaded. So then you have this whole list of your supporters, right? Step 4, get them to vote. Right. And it's so simple, but it's honestly, look, there are certain races that are not going to be winnable by just turning out your voters. You're going to have to persuade, and they're tough, right? They're very unlikely to win. But this cycle, we had the voters, right? Trump had the voters. Now, you could argue Harris had them as well, because there are a lot of people that did not vote, right? So the numbers show that it really is a turnout game, right? And I just think that a lot of people, this was the first cycle we understood that. But then if you ask me again, what kind of led to his victory? Well, number one, it is Donald Trump. He won, right? His name's on the ballot. So you have to, you can't miss the guy who wins. Number two, I think this whole cycle, from the feedback we saw at the door, from our conversations, looking at daily reports, and that's the best part about doing these programs, right? All the polling, all the people yapping on TV, the pundits, they don't know, right? We're talking directly to voters, and we can see the data in real time of what we're getting at the door, because every door we're collecting information and data. And what we found, yes, the economy was a huge issue. Yes, the border was a huge issue. But I got to tell you, Jim, the number one thing I boil this whole election down to is authenticity. Okay, I just think because of alternative media, because of podcasts, because of people getting their information on their phone, right? Whether it's Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, X, whatever it is, they're getting so much more. You're seeing so much more of people that you have a BS meter, right? You can tell, just normal people, you can tell. And when you compared Kamala Harris and her AstroTurf campaign and her saying so much without saying anything at all, the woman couldn't put a sentence together, compared to Donald Trump doing these 3-hour interviews and just shooting from the hip and being straight with people. I think that authenticity is something, it doesn't get reported that often. But when we talk to people, it really just shined through that they felt like Donald Trump was being honest, he was being real. And to them, it was the issues and the presidency. We had 4 years to compare his administration to Biden-Harris, right? That has not been done since Grover Cleveland, a non-consecutive term president where you could compare. There might have been some races where the person lost, I'm not sure. But it was such a clear difference. And it was like, which do you prefer? Are you better 4 years ago than you are now? Because that was the Donald Trump era. And I think that authenticity message, that was what really connected with people.
Well, and Donald Trump has a base of voters, and they have to be encouraged to vote in the calculation, the Lincoln calculation that both you and I live and die by as we can. There's the motivation of voters and the excitement of voters to get out. Again, this is that getting your voters out to vote stuff, and having a great candidate that will do that makes a huge difference. And Donald Trump is that. So, this is all about what happened. You can still win if your candidate has some flaws, FYI, if you do the work hard enough. And maybe a challenge, but if you do hard enough work, you can do it. Democrats in recent decades have been winning elections where their candidates are disliked because they did the work. So let's just keep that in mind. The broad aspect of this win was because Donald Trump was a great candidate. That's on Donald Trump's shoulders, and he carried that very, very well. So let's talk a little bit about then the goals you had. Quickly get to the results, and then I got a couple other final questions to go through. But you set out that you were going to go to about 500,000 doors, and really chase those GOP ballots. On the back end of what was very interesting in Pennsylvania from 2020, it was a bad year for Trump in Pennsylvania, but it wasn't actually the worst year for Republicans. I think you kept the legislature was entirely Republican after that. You still had the governor's race wasn't up that year, but won the treasurer and auditor general statewide races. And what's key about that is not just that you won them, but that what these races down ballot on a statewide level, they tell you what your voter base actually is, in a sense, because these are the races that there aren't a lot of commercials about. People aren't debating and arguing about. This is just what did the base do? And there's some, more particulars to that, but it roughly tells you. In fact, these are for those of us who run elections, you look at these races and their results in counties or districts that you're working to figure out what your base vote is, and then figure out what your persuadable vote is by knowing what your base vote is. So the question I have for you is, you knew that Pennsylvania could be won. You went after 500,000, and I know you're going to get the results, but what would you say really happened this year? What is the result that we saw in Pennsylvania? Because I know it wasn't just Donald Trump winning it. You probably saw a little bit more happening.
Yeah, so we won every statewide race. Okay, so that to me was valuable. And look, here was the best part. When we agreed to do this program, like I told you, we could target down ballot where we wanted to, right? So all the statewide candidates loved us because why? They're on every ballot, right? If we're targeting Republican turnout and they're on every ballot, they benefit from all 500,000 doors that we knock on, right? So they loved us. So we had to make decisions, down ballot on where we would target. So the first thing we targeted was congressional races, right? So we had 3 targets, PA 7, PA 8, and PA 10. PA 10 being Scott Perry. He was somebody we were defending. He's an incumbent. 7 and 8 were Democrats we were trying to take out. And we picked those because they were the 3 most, competitive. There's another one with Rob Mercury out in Pittsburgh that we also played in a little bit. But the 3 that we heavily targeted, it was it was almost exciting because Scott Perry had tons of money spent against him. But the other 2, they kind of took it for granted because they weren't ready for us, the Democrats, right? And so, happy to report here, Jim, we won all 3. We flipped the 2 seats in 7 and 8. We defended Scott Perry. But what we did is we put 3 of our 10 Airbnb houses that housed all of our ballot chasers in Scott's district, right? We even did a program at the end called the PA Chase Final Sprint, where we brought in an additional 100 volunteers just for the final 2 weeks in Scott's district because it was so razor thin. I mean, he won by less than a point. But we knew that every vote that we turned out there obviously would help Trump. It would help McCormick. It would help our treasurer, our auditor general, our attorney general races. And we won all of those. But you're right. The down ballots matter. Now, the state house in 20, we had it. In 22, we lost it. Okay. And I think a lot of that was pushback against the Republicans caving during COVID and enacting a lot of these laws that were supposed to be temporary that are now permanent. When I talk about 50 days of voting, that's one of them. That was Republicans who wrote that legislation. It was funny. Actually, I debated a Philadelphia city council member, a young black guy who's very articulate, but he was kind of startled because I think he just thought I was going to be a talking point for the GOP. And in the interview with BBC, this is like 2 days before the election, he goes off about how, Republicans, they wanted to, they would have never approved this type of 50-day voting. I said, Republicans wrote the legislation. And he just his head popped off his shoulders. He's not used to it. He said, well, you're not going to defend? I said, no, it's a complete mistake. The Republicans caved. The rhinos, they had no spine. They caved. They wrote this legislation. No, I'm not supportive of that. And his mind was broke. Anyway, so the whole entire process of us trying to battle down ballot, we did not flip the state house. Okay, there were a couple districts, that we targeted. We won most of the ones we targeted. One of the ones we didn't, I won't get into why, but the candidate refused to sign our pledge, and we now don't have the state house by 1 seat. So we still were not able to flip that back in 26. That'll be a major target. But the huge congressional wins. Look, Dave McCormick won by less than 20,000 votes. Okay, I'm very proud of the work that we did. Yes, Trump won by 120,000. But if there's ever a race to look at to know you made a significant difference, yes, the White House, but we flipped the Senate seat. If you would have told me a year ago that Bob Casey was beatable, I probably would have said you need to have your head examined. He's a very good politician. He understands how to run as a moderate. I did not
see any hope of McCormick winning that. And in fact, I don't think anyone through polls saw that happening until the very last minute. And you guys, your efforts probably won that, in my opinion.
Well, and in a weird way, sometimes you can get lucky in that sense that they weren't pouring in hundreds of millions. They were pouring in tens of millions to help him, the DNC. But yeah, I think it was, McCormick, I will give him credit. I think Dave ran one of the best statewide races I've ever seen. His ads were hard hitting. They connected. He was authentic. And
he came into that race with some fairly high negatives as well, too. I mean, in fact, that's why he lost in 2 years prior to that, was because he just built up a lot of negatives. It's become more positive now, but yeah, you're right. He did run a great campaign.
Yeah, so I think the coattails of what we did, were exciting. I have to now figure out, how do we take this momentum and this huge win and turn it into, what we would call permanent infrastructure. Right. So, yes, 2026 and 2028 are going to be huge. But in 2025, we have school board races. We have 9,000 judge of election races in every precinct across PA. We've got county executives. We've got mayoral races. So I have to, we're still planning that. I think there's a lot to learn from losing, but sometimes there's more to learn from winning. And a lot of people become blind to that, but we're trying to figure out what exactly works so we can do more of it. What was kind of neutral so we can either, improve it or stop doing it. And what didn't work, stop doing it, right? If it wasn't effective or wasn't impactful. But those are the conversations we're having right now.
Well, Nick Saban won 7 college national championships by being the kind of coach that even when they won, didn't make his players necessarily feel good. He pointed out where the problems were because it's continual progress that you have to make, particularly in a season where it's the end of the season that matters, not the middle. The wins in the middle are, you got to have all those wins, but they don't matter. It's that last win that matters. You're preparing for that last win. You have to do all the good things along the way, but you got to get to that last win. And Donald Trump's not going to be on the scene forever. We got to take the next steps, and that's going to happen through infrastructure. So what I want to ask you at this stage then, tell people about Citizens Alliance and what you're about, and what you guys are going to be working towards in these next 2-3 election cycles.
Yeah, so our plan is pretty simple. We have something called the Liberty State Project. So we're in these 4 states, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, North Dakota, and Idaho, and we work the state legislature, right? And what we're trying to do is get hardcore America First, real conservatives to represent the Republican Party, right? So we're not afraid to go after rhinos in primaries. We've taken out 5 incumbents in Pennsylvania out of the 6 that we've targeted the last 2 cycles. And it's not cheap. We've spent over $2 million to do that. And I get a lot of people that call me and say, Cliff, spend your money against Democrats. Why? Why, when you have Democrats that run as Republicans, would we sit by and let these people represent our party? They don't stand for our principles. They sell us out at every turn. And in every battle where it's the working class versus the swamp, they're on the wrong side.
That's right.
And so, I'm trying to
and by the way, quick, I want to interject here and say this. You guys probably helped Scott Perry pull across the finish line. There was no Republican in Washington, D.C., hardly, who wanted Scott Perry to win. They were not putting money into his race. They were putting money in other races, and they didn't do it until the very last. And I know Scott, and from my time on Capitol Hill, he's a rock star. He's a really great guy. He needed to win that race, but they didn't want him to win.
Yeah, and I think it's there are very few politicians I get excited about, as you know, Jim. Most of them are not. You can count on one hand, maybe 2 in a good Congress. The people that are real champions. But for Scott to be a top target for a takeout from the DCCC, we had to double down, right? So he was somebody we wanted to help. And so our whole objective with Citizens Alliance is pretty simple. We have a pledge that we run. We do candidate endorsements. We do candidate trainings. So if anybody out there is thinking about running, come out to one of our trainings. It's 1 day. We teach you the nuts and bolts to go from 0 to 100, from knowing nothing to being able to run. What we care about, which are 2 things when it comes to campaigns: a candidate that is viable and a candidate that's principled, right? You got to have both. There's a lot of candidates out there that are viable, but they're not going to be principled. And unfortunately, there's a lot of our friends that are principled. They're not running viable campaigns. Right? They don't have the money. They don't have the messaging. They don't have the infrastructure. They don't understand how to talk to voters. And so we try to fix both of those problems. But if I pull back and tell you, Cliff, what does success look like for Citizens Alliance? Well, in our states, when we try to create this Liberty State, there are 3 boxes we want to check. Number 1, 25% of the state house to be pledge signers in good standings to champions, 25% of the state Senate to be the same. And then we want to elect a Liberty governor. And we feel like, Jim, if we can do that in one state, we can be the example, right? We can go in, we can have universal school choice. We can cut all of the property taxes, abolish income tax in the state. We can get the woke and DEI stuff out of our schools, cut regulations. Why? Because we want to increase quality of life. We want businesses to flock there. And then we want red states, supposed red states, to say, why aren't we like Idaho? Why aren't we doing these massive reforms that improve people's lives based on the principles of liberty. And so that is kind of, when I wake up in the morning, yes, we just delivered PA with all of our partners for Trump, and I would argue save the republic. Yes, we're having these massive wins, but that is the granular detail of what I'm trying to do through Citizens Alliance, because I think we need an example. Yes, you have great states like Florida that are leading on a lot of this. Tennessee, Texas is doing some great stuff. There are certain battles
Louisiana,
we're
a lot of
winning.
people aren't paying attention to Louisiana, but that's actually going to be a future model state. And Jeff Landry, who's a really good friend of mine, a couple of hiccups, there are a couple of things there that some people had some negatives on, but he's a rock star, and you've got a legislature there that has the core group there, even though you got the rhinos as well too. So yeah, there's some real opportunities for that kind of a change. And by the way, consider this. All the Republican states out there, and none of them in 2021, after all the schools were shut down everywhere in 2020, none of them went to full school choice. And everybody in the country would have accepted that. And then none of them have a plan to do that. You need to break this government monopoly over schools, and Republicans have all the right reasons to do that. And right now, a president who will support that. These fundamental things have got to change. You can only do it by getting the right players, not just the red players, but the right red players in there that are willing to take the right steps.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And so I'm going to continue those battles. I think state level stuff is in 2018, when I started doing these door knocking programs targeted at state level, it was tough, Jim, right? There were a lot of activists, a lot of donors. It's very, very sexy to focus on federal races, right? You turn on the TV, what's everybody talking about? Congress. They're talking about the House. They're talking about the Senate. They're talking about these big presidential races. And I get it. That's the focus. That's what your attention span is. But what happened in 2020 that changed the folks' interest in state races? Two things. One, like you said, during COVID, wow, there were a couple really, really good examples of states pushing back on the feds being the only check and balance, right? All through the Biden administration, a lot of these states were the only rational actors pushing back on some of the woke garbage and some of these things from DC. That was number one. Number two, people said, hold on a second. Who certifies the elections? These state legislatures do. And so all of a sudden I had this double whammy that opened up so many eyes in both the activist, grassroots, and funder world that really made people realize we have to fix the states and it'll work itself up. And so that, to me, if you're somebody out there looking to get involved, don't jump in and run for Congress. Don't jump in and volunteer for Senate races. I mean, look, help good people. But if you really want to spend your time wisely, who is your state rep? What are they doing to defend your liberty? How are they going on offense? What are they blocking and playing defense on? That is where you should spend a lot of your time.
And that's your bench for future great congressional races, because then you have someone, if they get elected and they go through the beating that being a liberty-minded legislator, that you're required to go through, it's a gauntlet to do it. If you can withstand that, then you'll be able to withstand a gauntlet that's quite similar in Congress. The thing that a liberty-minded congressman goes through is very similar to what happens at the state legislative level. And a lot of even state legislators don't know how prepared they already are to come and do good work in Congress. But you have to have that bench of people who have gone through it in some way or another. And because the success rate of stated liberty-minded people that run for Congress who actually do that when they get there, after now 20 years of doing that directly in Congress myself in one form or another, it's pretty low. But it will only happen if they're really good down there. But so before we close out, so you've talked a little bit about this. What does the future look like? What do you see happening in 2026? What results do you think we are going to have based upon how you're looking at it right now? What do you think the key factors for that success are? And then tell people a little bit about your Citizens Alliance and how they can get a hold of you and so forth.
Yeah, well, one, I think the number one battle in terms of the future of the republic is going to be what I call the DOGE versus the swamp. Okay, so if you ask me to predict, I think what will happen is Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and Ron Paul, they're going to go to Donald Trump and they're going to say, listen, here are the reforms you need. We got to cut these thousands of regulations. We got to get rid of these 3 to 5 departments. We got to cut spending across the board by 5, 10, 15%. And that's how we're going to save the republic. And then the battle begins, right? The swamp will do what the swamp does. Oh, that's not how we do things around here. You know, we need incremental change. They're going to call us radicals. And that's going to be the battle, you know? And does Trump double down? Do Elon and Vivek, you know, convince John Thune and Mike Johnson? Because that's going to be the conversation. And I think John Thune and Mike Johnson have one of the greatest opportunities. I'm rooting for them. I think they have one of the greatest opportunities to have a personal legacy as the best Speaker of the House and the best majority leader in American history. Because you have such a pivotal time where the mandate from the American people is we want radical reform. We want to drain the swamp. We need to get this regulatory and this spending beast under control. And so they're going to have to decide, do they go with the corrupt special interests that fund a lot of the establishment programs and candidates? Or do they say, you know what, we're going to stand up to that. We're going to go with DOGE and we're going to get this done. And we're going to whip all of our members into shape and actually figure out how we enact these reforms. And yes, so that's the battle. That will dictate how 2026 looks. Okay, if in the first 100 days of the Trump admin for 47, if they're able in the first 100 days to enact a lot of these reforms and people can see the benefits of those towards the end of 2025 and into 2026, I think we could have a very good midterm. If they stonewall and they do what the swamp does and they block Trump and DOGE and they really figure out a way to just kind of drag this thing along and the economy's kind of sluggish and this whole mandate is not fulfilled, I think 2026 is horrible. And I think it puts us in a bad position for 28. So I think the future will depend upon that battle between DOGE, Thune, and Johnson. Those two parties will have to make a decision on where we go, and I think everything after that will be dictated by that. If people want to, you know, go ahead.
And a lot, and all the members below those two guys, there are a lot of folks there that can drag them down as well, no matter what they want to do. But go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that will be the battle, right? Do they whip people into shape or not? I think the nicest thing now, I talked about authenticity, you know, with alternative media, with podcasts, with people getting their news on their phone, they can get things in real time. And so it's no longer the Senate Majority Leader comes out for a press conference and then 2 weeks later there's an update. It is in real time. Joni Ernst, where do you stand on this nomination? We need an answer. Oh, you don't want to give us an answer? Up the pressure. 12 hours later, we've got an answer. Okay, that never happened before. So I think those battles are the ones to get involved with. I will keep telling people to focus on the state level. What we're doing at Citizens Alliance, people can check me out on X at Maloney. I'm going to give constant updates there. If you want to get on our email list, pachase.com, you can look at what we're doing. It kind of laid out the whole blueprint. Folks can sign up there for email updates for our relaunch. And if you're in Idaho, New Hampshire, North Dakota, or Pennsylvania, we'd really like to talk. Get you out to a candidate training, get you looped in with our programs. But Jim, this is about permanent infrastructure. And I will continue to make that what I'm trying to build for Liberty Warriors. Obviously, will help up and down the ticket. But I think door to door and actually doing grassroots, as you know, you've championed this. This is something we must match the Democrats on, and I'm committed to doing that.
Cliff Maloney, I appreciate what you do. This is absolutely the focus, the target of what is going to help us maintain this, the results of this big victory that we had in 2024. And we cannot underestimate how big it is. There are a million things we can talk about, you know, censorship and inflation and all these things that relate to it. But all of that's a result of the want of this sort of activity. So I'm glad for what you're doing. And of course, we're going to work with you because that's what we're training our people here at the Conservative Caucus to do. So, but Cliff, I appreciate you taking some time with me today. It's been a fantastic discussion. We'll do it again and get an update from you and definitely let us know along the way. And again, go to pachase.com or .org.
.com.
and definitely follow Cliff at Maloney on X, and you're gonna be able to keep up with what's going on. Appreciate you, my friend. Thanks for taking a little time. Hey, before we get to final thoughts from Cliff Maloney, I just want to encourage you, if you like what you hear, please share this podcast with people. We really thank you for being part of this. I know that you're going to get a lot of information in the future from the things that we're doing. And as we develop this podcast and this show, we want your feedback and input as well. Go to email us at info@theconservativecaucus.org. That's info@theconservativecaucus.org. Let us know ideas that you have for future podcasts that you'd like us to do. And definitely, if you enjoy what you're listening to, share this podcast with your friends. First of all, I want you actually give us 5 stars on your podcast app and like the podcast. That helps promote what we're doing. But again, share the podcast with other friends. And of course, if you want more information on how you can get involved with us at the Conservative Caucus, go to theconservativecaucus.org. That's theconservativecaucus.org. Now, some final comments and final closing with my friend Cliff Maloney.